Okay, so today we pick up with part two of Shemot or Exodus 19. We're going to begin with verse 11 eventually. Going to begin with it eventually. Anyway, I was going to, yeah. We were talking last week about the steps in the Hebrew wedding custom as they came about in the time of Moshe, between there and today. The first step was that the bride had to, the first step that the bride took in preparation for her marriage was to meet with the groom. The second step for her was to decide whether she wanted to accept his proposal or not. The third step was the washing, or what we think of today as the baptism. But this was of the body, the clothes, and the heart. The heart and mind being one thing in Hebrew, basically everything that's carnal. From this uh, verse 10, we get the idea of the Arusa, which is the time of this setting apart. It was the time that the bride was to prepare her body, her heart, her soul, and her mind before entering into the covenant. And what we saw in verse 10 was God telling them, the people, to go and prepare, because the people are, in this case, the bride, and God is the groom. So we see this happening. We see him saying, go, prepare yourselves. Because the children of Israel were about to give their whole self, their whole body, their whole soul, their whole strength for the rest of their life to God. The rest of their life, they were agreeing to do everything that God said to do, and they were agreeing not to do everything God said not to do. He was going to have absolute rule in their lives. So they needed to be prepared. They needed to be emotionally and mentally and physically ready for this. They were going to give their life, they were going to live their life rather, set apart from all others, belonging only to their God. They weren't going to bow before another God. They weren't going to worship other gods. I mean, this is what the promise was. They were about to surrender their life and any authority that they had over it. Because at this point, they have the authority to either surrender it to God or to keep it for themselves. They really had this. And they were about to give their authority, their right to be angry, their right to tell someone off, their right for revenge, their right, whatever rights they had, they were about to surrender those rights to God. Now, God doesn't tell us not to be angry. He tells us to be angry, but no, don't sin, right? So anger is not wrong until we let it overcome us and we sin because of it. But our right to hang on to it, our right to revenge it, that kind of stuff, we're going to give that over to God. Now, if God says this is what you do in order to avenge it, well, then you can do that. But if there is no law like that, then the only vengeance that's going to be there is whatever vengeance God takes. Of course, we know that vengeance belongs to God, not us. So we're giving up our right to have vengeance. All of these things that we think of as just basic human rights, we're giving them up. And we're going to live totally and completely by God's law, not our feelings, not our laws. The Arusa is made up of three steps. The, the three steps that we go through in preparation of giving our heart, soul, and strength to God. The first step is, of course, this is the salvation process as laid out by God. If for those who haven't caught on by now, we don't do this because something took a hold of our heart, but when we do this, God will take a hold of our heart. In other words, what I'm saying here, and this is can be very touchy among Christians, because I really totally get this. When I was 9 years old, my mother took my sister and I to a Christian church, and we listened to that preacher get up there and talk about, our God, our Father God and our brother Jesus. And, I didn't have an older brother. That sounded cool to me, and a father that would never hit you or or be angry to you or raise his voice to you sounded real good to me at the time. And so it it registered on that emotional level, and I went running to the front, arms flailing and snot flying, as I like to say, because that's exactly how it was going down. And I went in there, and they had to calm me down so I could say the sinner's prayer. That's not how this works. Be something that registers on a mental level, not an emotional. Because when you register on an emotional level, once those emotions are gone, it's just like people getting married and divorced today. I feel the love. This is just the one, and they register on an emotional level and don't stop and think about. We don't even speak the same language. We don't even know how to communicate with each other. And she was raised Eastern Orthodox, and I was raised Western atheist socks. Atheodox. There we go, atheodox. And this is never going to work, right? So there has to be, in God's world, it's not an emotional connection. It's a mental connection. I've heard the proposal. I know this is the right thing for me. I know it's the right thing to do, so therefore I'm going to do it. Now, when we've made that decision and we go through the purification process, I'm telling you, there's probably going to be something emotional happening then, but it's not supposed to be emotion that gets you to the altar. It's supposed to be a rational decision that gets to the altar, and then what happens at the altar is no doubt going to be emotional. That's the difference here. This is what we need to really consider. So let's begin today with Shemot, or Exodus 19:11. Uh, I have it translated this way. This is God speaking. And you will become prepared for the third day. So he's going to come to them on the third day. He's going to make his appearance. So they've got 3 days to prepare. You will be prepared on the third day, for in the third day, and he calls himself Yahweh, calls himself by his name. For in the third day, Yahweh will go in the presence. Now, I have in the presence, but it literally says Yahweh will go to the eyes, or two eyes, not the eyes, but two eyes. Well, it's to go in the presence of all the people on the mountain of Sinai. So let me read it just without all the idiom there. And you will become prepared for the third day. For in the third day, Yahweh will go in the presence of all the people on the mountain of Sinai. Now, verse 12, and you will establish borders around the people, because remember, God's talking to Moshe here. You will establish borders around the people, saying, guard yourselves from going to the mountain and touching the borders. All who touch the borders will die the death. That's pretty serious, right? Onkelos by Drazen and Wagner says that the implication is that not only ascending the mountain was prohibited, but also approaching its borders was prohibited. Okay, I can live with that. Now, the original Onkelos, as well as the Sadia, both translated Bim Shoch HaYovel as when the shofar is blown, while Rashi interprets it as the drawn out blast of the shofar. So Rashi saw this as when the blast was long, when it was drawn out very long, where the other two saw it as just when it was blown. Okay, now we go on to 13, Shemot 13, 19:13. No hand shall touch it. And God's still speaking about the border. You won't even touch the border. For stoned he will be stoned, or impaled he will be impaled. Whether livestock or man, he will not live. When the ram's horn draws out long, these will go to the mountain. No hand will touch. Think about that. No hand will so much as touch the border, right? Casuto said that there was obviously a symbolic significance. Otherwise, the notion of touching the mountain would be bizarre. He also pointed out that the threefold use of touching was done for emphasis. It's not 3 bullet points, it's just there for emphasis. The other thing here is when the ram's horn draws out long, these will go to the mountain. Kasuto said that the long blast of the ram's horn is a signal to Moshe, so he will know when the rest of the people are finally allowed to come up to the mountain. All right, so we move to verse 14. And Moshe went down from the mountain to the people and purified the people, and they washed their garments. Before I move on from there, Moshe purified the people. So did Moshe go down and get a soap in one hand and a rag in the other and give all those people a bath? No. Did he go down and make a sacrifice for them? The sacrifice to purify? Nope, this is not where the sacrifice happens. So what's happening? How does Moshe purify the people? He goes down and he tells them what God just said to him. He tells them, you have to wash your bodies. You have to wash your clothing. You have to, men and women have to stay separated, if you will, if I can put that delicately, for the next 3 days. You have to prepare your heart, your soul, and your mind for this over these next 3 days. That's how Moshe purified the people. Now, in verse 15, it says, and he, speaking of Moshe, said to the people, be ready by the 3rd day, and do not draw near to a woman. I kind of alluded to that earlier. Kasuto believed that Moshe added these words because it was Moshe's personal interpretation of the commandment to be pure. That's reasonable, that this is his interpretation and not so much his what he was just told, because he wasn't just told that specifically that we know of. So it is more likely that this is his interpretation. But we do know by other portions of the law that this would make a man and a woman impure, right? So maybe he already knew. He had spent 40 years with God on the mountain, by the way, so he probably already knew. Now, Shemot 19:16 says, and it came to pass on the 3rd day in the morning, and there was voices and flashes of lightning and a heavy cloud on the mountain, and the voice of the shofar was very strong, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. So let's talk about there were voices. Kasuto pointed out that using the word for voices instead of thunder was poetic. Thus, here the meaning is thunder claps. So let me read it what we like to call the right way. And it came to pass in the 3rd day in the morning, there was claps of thunder and flashes of lightning and a heavy cloud on the mountain, and the voice of the shofar was very strong, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. Now I point this out because there's a later tradition where I think it's the students of Rashi are asked about the voices on the mountain, and they come up with this whole thing from Jeremiah where it's like a hammer hitting a rock and the sparks are flying out, and these sparks are, so God's voice is like a hammer. It's these sparks that are going out to the 70 elders, and all that sounds really cool and all that kind of stuff, but that's not what's being said. It's just saying that there's claps of thunder. Okay, now in the book, a commentary on the book of Exodus, Umberto Moshe David Casuto wrote the following. Even the strong wind in the story of Elijah is alluded to here, for the expression and the sound of a horn exceedingly loud does not really refer to the note of a horn or a shofar, called in verse 13 Yovel, which is ram's horn, right? A ram's horn is called Yovel. It's also called shofar. But when they want to be specific that it's, what the horn is, they say Yovel. But if they're just saying blow the horn, they'll usually say shofar. I added all that. So he says it's not the note of a horn. It signifies the strong wind that blows violently through the gorges between the mountains, rendering the air with a great noise like the sound of a horn. Which is really interesting when you think about the verse where it says, and so they shall fear him from the east and from the west. You know, the Spirit of God will come in like a flood, and when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of God will lift up the standard. It's a really, really bad translation in English, because what it should have said is when the enemy comes in, put a comma there, like a flood, the Spirit of God drives on, which doesn't make a lot of sense to the Western English speaking reader. But it's this very thing. It's the signification of a strong wind that blows violently through the gorges and the mountains. You know, here comes a rushing, mighty wind. It's a hint to Christians. Okay, so in verse 17 it says, and Moshe brought the people from the camp to meet with God, and they stood on the outer edges of the mountain. Now, Rashi, based on the Mechilta, said the Shekinah went out to meet the people like a groom to his bride, to give the Ketuvah, or the Torah, or otherwise known as the marriage document. He based this idea on the fact that the Hebrew word likrat, used here, is for the most part used of two people approaching each other. So he's got a fairly good argument. Even Ezra said that this verse spoke of the readiness of the people to accept God. Yes and no. This speaks of the readiness that should have been there. Whether it was there or not, we can't know. We can doubt because of the things that happened during and after these events. I find it doubtful that that it's speaking of their readiness. But it is speaking of the readiness that should have been there on that day. All right, Shemot 19:18. And the entire face of the mountain was smoking, and Yahweh descended on it, speaking of the mountain, in fire. And the smoke went up as the smoke of a smelting furnace, and the whole mountain greatly trembled. That's incredible when you think about it. So the whole face of the mountain, the part that the people are looking at, is just covered in smoke. There's lightning, there's thunder, there's the rushing mighty wind. It's like this massive storm happening on this mountain. It'd be kind of scary, don't you think? And then and Yahweh comes down, and there's fire that goes before him. I heard that somewhere before. It goes before him, consuming all his enemies. And maybe that's why he's telling the children of Israel not to come up, because that fire is going to consume them, because they're not supposed to be there, right? And they're not his enemies, so he's giving them heads up. Enemies won't get that. I'm just thinking out loud here. So he comes down on the fire, and the smoke went up as the smoke of a smelting furnace. You realize there's all smoke, 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 fire, 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 all that. Everything's being repeated, repeated, repeated. So it's building and the emphasis is growing here, right? And they're not doing this so you have a whole bunch of, okay, this is one kind of smoke, and there's another kind of smoke, and there's one kind of fire, and there's another kind of fire. You know, it's not bullet points. They're trying to tell you that this is more, the description to me is more like a pyroclastic flow. If you so much as get caught up in the smoke, you're a goner. I hope you understand that. And this storm, or whatever it is that's being described, was so powerful that it was causing the entire mountain to tremble. But you know, the mountains do melt like wax in the presence of God. I read that somewhere before. Okay, Shemot 19:19. And when the voice of the shofar went out very strong, Moshe spoke, and God answered with a voice. You think he said, "This is God speaking"? I can't do the God voice. I'm sorry. Okay. So this is God speaking ambiently, is what they're trying to tell you. The Hebrew and Aramaic texts of Onkelos both added the Hebrew word shamayim, saying that God answered from the heavens. This word is not found in the Masoretic text, by the way. The addition of this word caused enormous consternation among the sages, since verses 18 and 20 both say that God was on the mountain, and now he's speaking from the heavens. You see a problem here? He's on the mountain, but he's speaking from the heavens. Even so, the Hebrew word shamayim means heavens, skies, and even clouds. And didn't the text say God was on the mountain and the mountain was covered with clouds? Pretty simple, isn't it? So we don't have to go and write 300-page dissertations how God was on the mountain, but his voice came from heaven. Come on now. He just spoke from the clouds. But what's cool about it, if you think, everybody heard it. This wasn't just Moshe hearing it and everybody else is passed out on the ground and no one's hearing it. They're just seeing the light, like with Shaul. No, everybody saw the thunder. They saw the lightning. They heard the noise. They felt the wind. They felt the shaking of the mountain. They heard the voice of God with their own ears. That's incredible to me. Verse 20. And Yahweh descended on Mount Sinai to the head of the mountain, and Yahweh called Moshe from the top of the mountain, and Moshe ascended. So Yahweh's coming down, Moshe's going up. Okay, verse 21. And Yahweh said to Moshe, descend, testify to the people, lest they break through to see Yahweh, and many souls die. Testify. Rashi interpreted this as warn them. Kasuto said that the command was twofold. It was A, to stress that the boundaries between the divine and the heaven is not to be crossed, and B, it is important at this crucial moment to repeat the warning. He also pointed out that, again, the triple use of the subject was in accord with the common literary practice of the time. In other words, it was there for emphasis. All right? What bothers me about this here says that the command was twofold. It was to stress the boundaries between the divine, and there's all these other arguments that you read about why God was doing this twice. I think it's real simple. I think that there were people who were going to go up the mountain and want to see God, and it was going to be a lot of them. And that fire that goes before them was going to consume them. They were not, because they wouldn't have known where to stop. They wouldn't have been like Moshe knew where to stop. They wouldn't have known that. They just would have gotten excited. Think about the one they call Caleb, Joshua, the son of Nun, rather, where Caleb came from. But they would have run up the mountain to see God. There would have been no holding them back, right? But God says, no, go back down there and warn them again, because obviously it was going to happen. So anyway, verse 22, and also the Kohanim, which do not exist at this point, just thought I'd point that out. The Kohanim who are drawing near to Yahweh be sanctified, lest Yahweh break forth in them. Kohanim. Kasuda pointed out that the Kohanim did not yet exist. Thus Rashi, even Ezra, Rashbam, and Kasudo believe Kohanim is referring to the firstborn. Because if there are no priests at this point, and you're using the word for priests, it must mean something else, right? I would like to propose a different reason for the use of the word Kohanim. I believe it was God's intention to fully enter into covenant with the Yehudim that day. Further, I believe that God actually intended for every Yehudi, every Jew present and yet to come was to be a Kohanim, was to be a Kohen, to be a priest. But because the people turned and ran and asked God to speak to Moshe, God made the marriage contract with Israel two part: engagement, which took place at Sinai, and consummation, which takes place with Mashiach. Also, instead of all Yehudim being Kohanim, now only those born to a particular bloodline will be Kohen, will be priests. I think that changed. I think that that was God's original intention. And where it says, lest Yahweh break forth in them. Pseudo said that lest Yahweh break forth in them is the same thing as saying measure for measure. If they break through the boundary, the Lord will break out upon them. It's like saying an eye for an eye. So he's saying if you cross this boundary, you're going to die. Because I've told you that's the punishment. In verse 23 it says, and Moshe said to Yahweh, the people are not able to ascend to Mount Sinai, for you testified in us, saying, make a border around the mountain and sanctify it. So he's saying, what are you talking about, God? What do you know? I mean, I went down there and I told them to put the border up, and they put the border up. Nobody's going to, don't you worry about it, God. You know, well, you're just being ridiculous, right? That's kind of what's going on here. He said, I did what you told me to do. Verse 24, this is God speaking. And Yahweh said to him, go, descend, you and Aharon with you. But the Kohanim and the people will not break through and ascend to Yahweh, lest he break through in them. So, obviously, he was talking of all the people as if they were priests. Because he'd already made up his mind, this is what's going to happen. And what happened? Anyway. So since God knew that they were going to break through and a whole bunch of them were going to die, he's telling Moshe, go back down and tell them again. So verse 25, and Moshe descended to the people and spoke to them. Now in his book, a commentary on the book of Exodus, Umberto Moshe David Casuto wrote the following. Our detailed exposition of this chapter has shown that the whole chapter can be explained simply as a single sequence, and that there is no reason to regard it as a collection of fragments derived from various sources, as many modern commentators have supposed. The name Elohim occurs several times, verses 3, 17, and 19, in place of the tetragrammaton, in order to indicate also by this variation that the Lord, speaking of Yahweh, who chose Yisrael of the entire world, and that the whole earth belongs to him. He's alluding to verse 5 there. Well, it was short, hopefully sweet, and very to the point today, but this concludes our journey through chapter 19. Shalom, shalom, y'all.